His ruthless leadership earned him the nickname the Red Terror. Mengistu Haile Mariam ruled Ethiopia for just 4 years, between 1975 and 1979. But in that time, his brutal Marxist regime murdered 1.5 million people. His conviction for genocide was 12 years in the making, but at least raises some hope of justice for his thousands of victims, as Mike Sullivan reports.
Mengistu Haile Mariam, a low-ranking army officer who took part in the coup that overthrew Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie 32 years ago, plotted and murdered his way to become the dictator president of his country, heading a series of governments and a succession of ministers who sought to replace the country's feudal system with Marxist policies. At the height of his power, Ethiopia, backed and equipped by Cuba and the Soviet Union, had the largest army in sub-Saharan Africa and a formidable air force and navy. It's taken 12 years for a court in Addis Ababa to decide that Mengistu is guilty as charged of genocide. But only some of his accomplices were there to listen to the judgment, and Mengistu is beyond the court's reach. The presiding judge announced that those present and Mengistu conspired to destroy a political group and kill people with impunity. Mengistu's totalitarian rule, famine and the forcible resettlement of hundreds of thousands of peasants in order to deny his rebel enemies comfort or support led to 1 million of them starving to death on Ethiopia's barren plains. Thousands more were murdered in Mengistu's struggle to stay in power, but in 1991 he was deposed and fled to exile in Zimbabwe as the guest of Robert Mugabe, protesting his innocence of genocide.
Have given order, map out the tactic and strategy, but I myself didn't shoot anybody.
The Ethiopia that Mengistu abandoned when he resigned in 1991 was left with the constant threat of famine and armed conflict, from which it is yet to free itself completely, and his conviction of the crime of genocide in his absence is of little comfort to the millions who suffered his rule but survived. Michael Sullivan, Al Jazeera.
And joining me from our London studios, Dr. Martin Hill, an Ethiopian researcher for Amnesty International. How important is this case and the verdict for international law and human rights?
It's been a very important case for human rights, for justice and the rule of law. If the trial has been fair, as it seems to have been, it should send a message that there will be no impunity for those who've committed war crimes, crimes against humanity and massive human rights violations.
But Dr. Hill, he has been tried in absentia. He's living a life of luxury in Zimbabwe. So does it really mean anything?
Well, the Ethiopian government has pressed for his extradition, but this has been refused by President Mugabe. But it's not just a question of Mengistu, it's about the whole regime and the others who've been on trial in court, as well as others who have fled the country in 1991. So there are 35 people now who've been convicted in court. Their sentences will be announced on the 28th of December.
And do you think the sentences were fair and will hold?
They have been tried in open court with lawyers and the right of appeal and the right to petition for clemency. It's very likely that they will be sentenced to death, which in Amnesty International's view is another violation of human rights.
Okay, Dr. Martin Hill, thank you very much for joining us. A bomb has exploded at a revered mosque in Iraq, where a similar attack earlier this year unleashed a wave of sectarian killing nationwide. Samarra's Al-Askari shrine with its famous golden dome is one of the holiest places in Shia Islam. It was badly damaged in attacks in February. This latest bomb was discovered at the mosque entrance and exploded while US forces were trying to remove it. Now, meanwhile, at least 70 people have been killed in a double bombing in the capital Baghdad. Most of the dead were Iraqis who were simply looking for jobs as day laborers. The bomber lured many of them to his truck with the promise of work. When they gathered around the vehicle, it exploded. A second bomb hidden in a parked car was also detonated. The Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has blamed the attack on Sunni fighters. And our Iraq correspondent Hoda Abdul Hamid reports.
The all too familiar sight of blood and debris on the streets of Baghdad. 2 bombs exploded simultaneously in a large square where day laborers gather in the hope of getting a job. Witnesses say one bomb hidden in a parked car exploded near a police patrol. A few meters away, a suicide bomber blew himself up.
The accident happened between 7 and 7:30 this morning. There was a coach there, and the driver was asking for labourers, and he collected people who were innocent and in need of money, and who thought the government would help them. And then he exploded the coach. There were more than 100 victims, and more than 50 injured. And this is one of the injured people. He's got a family. He's got 7 girls.
Baghdad is gripped by a vicious circle of tit-for-tat sectarian killings. Attacks have become bolder and deadlier and do not spare anyone. These latest victims were workers hoping to put bread on the table. Instead, they have just become a number in the daily death toll. Huda Abdelhamid, Al Jazeera.
Somalia's Islamic Courts movement has threatened to wage war on Ethiopian troops if they don't leave the country within 7 days. Witnesses say thousands of Ethiopian troops have crossed the border to protect the small area of territory held by the transitional government around the town of Baidoa. Sheikh Yusuf Mohammed Siad, the Islamic Courts Union defense chief, made the threats in Mogadishu.
We demand the Ethiopian troops currently deployed on Somali territory to leave within 7 days. The international community should convince Ethiopia to do so, or else the Somali people will take all action necessary to repel this aggression. We have information that the Kenyan authorities plan to provide a cover for the Ethiopian troops across its borders to invade Somali territories. We ask the Kenyan government not to intervene in Somali affairs for the sake of stability and good neighborhood.
At least 7 people have been killed in southern Afghanistan after a suicide bomber blew himself up in the compound of a provincial governor. The attack took place in Lashkar Gah, the capital of Helmand province. Governor Mohammed Duad was in his office at the time of the blast but escaped injury. The Taliban has reportedly said it was behind the attack. Now, the man leading the international investigation into the murder of former Lebanese Premier Rafik al-Hariri says his inquiries are reaching a sensitive and complicated phase. Serge Bramarets made that assessment in his update report to the UN. And Bramarets says ongoing political divisions are creating further tension and instability in Lebanon. Those political divisions are yet to be resolved. Al Jazeera's Rula Amin reports.
The Lebanese cabinet met to take yet another step towards the establishment of a court with an international character to try the suspects in the assassination of the late Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. The government had already approved the draft agreement with the UN to establish such a court, but after 2 weeks sitting at the presidential palace, Lebanon's president Emil Lahoud wouldn't endorse it. He sent it back to the cabinet, saying that Prime Minister Signora's government had lost its legitimacy, and its decisions, including approving this draft, were null and void.
We affirm that this government is constitutional and legitimate. We miss the participation of our colleagues who resigned, and we will not take any step that will violate our constitution.
The cabinet decided to send the draft to the parliament anyway, to be approved as a treaty with the United Nations. The pro-government coalition, the March 14th, has the majority at the parliament. But the Speaker of the Parliament, Nabih Berri, himself now part of the opposition, has made it clear he won't call for a session. He shares the President's view. The Cabinet's decisions are not constitutional.
We certainly hope that Mr. Berri will call the Parliament to approve this treaty. But in the event that Mr. Berri doesn't, we will follow every constitutional process.
The standoff over the establishment of the court has become part of even a more dangerous crisis, one that's paralyzing Lebanon and threatening its stability. The government says the opposition has one sole goal: to derail the establishment of the International Court. The opposition accuses the government of using the court to escape bigger issues. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue. Arab League Secretary General is back in Beirut for one more attempt to bridge the differences.
The situation will always maintain hope.
So far, no report of any progress.